The morning sun, a warm caress on my back, was a welcome distraction. I knelt in the soft dirt along my driveway, carefully placing the last of my tomato seedlings. After 15 grueling years, working 80-hour weeks at the law firm, I'd finally found a sliver of peace in cultivating life. The feel of the rich soil between my fingers, the quiet promise of fresh vegetables. It was a balm to my soul. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" I looked up, startled. Brenda Williams, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, stood at the edge of my property. Her arms were crossed tightly over her designer blouse, a picture of disapproval. Her perfectly highlighted hair didn't dare move in the gentle breeze, and her lips were pressed into a thin, judgmental line. "Good morning, Brenda," I said, wiping my hands on my gardening apron, a genuine smile attempting to smooth over the intrusion. "Just expanding my vegetable garden a bit." Her eyes narrowed, lasers focusing on the neat rows of raised beds that now lined the side of my driveway. "Completely unacceptable, Mark. Front yards in Willow Creek Estates must be properly landscaped with approved plants only. Vegetable gardens belong in backyards, hidden from view." She punctuated her statement with a dramatic huff. I took a deep, calming breath. Brenda had been the head of our homeowners association for the past 5 years, and in that time, our once friendly neighborhood had devolved into a minefield of petty rules and shockingly unexpected fines. "Brenda, my property deed predates the HOA by 30 years. I've got grandfather exemptions on most of these regulations." I stood up, suddenly acutely aware of how my dirt-stained jeans contrasted sharply with her immaculate appearance. "That's not how it works," she snapped, pulling out her phone with a flourish. "I'm documenting this violation. The board will be notified immediately." My jaw tightened as I watched her take multiple photos, her fingers flying across her screen with practiced efficiency. 2 neighbors, walking their dogs, slowed down, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding confrontation. I felt a flush of anger rising in my chest. "I've read every single page of the HOA agreement," I stated calmly, my voice even despite the turmoil within. "And I've kept all correspondence with the previous board, acknowledging my exemptions. Would you like to see the paperwork?" She waved her hand dismissively, a gesture that reeked of arrogance. "Save it for the hearing. You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation by tomorrow. I suggest you remove all this." She gestured vaguely at my garden, her nose wrinkling in disgust. "Mess before fines begin accumulating." As she marched away, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement, I noticed Mr. Peterson from across the street giving me a sympathetic look. He'd had his own run-in with Brenda last month over the color of his new mailbox. Apparently, forest green wasn't the same as the approved hunter green. The absurdity of it all was almost comical. That evening, true to her word, a bright orange violation notice was taped to my front door, a $53 daily fine until the unapproved agricultural activity was removed from my front yard. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I took the notice inside, my heart heavy, and added it to my growing file, sarcastically labeled HOA nonsense. But something about this felt different, more targeted, more personal. My phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. It was Sarah Miller, the sweet, elderly woman who'd lived down the street since before the development even had a name. "Mark, dear," her voice crackled through the phone, laced with concern. "I saw Brenda harassing you this morning. You're not the first, you know. Last month, she had the board fine, the Thompsons $500, because their daughter's wheelchair ramp didn't match the architectural aesthetic of the neighborhood." My blood boiled. "That can't be legal," I exclaimed, my grip tightening on the phone. "It wasn't," Sarah confirmed, her voice dropping to a near whisper. But the Thompsons couldn't afford to fight it. They paid the fine and painted the ramp. Brenda's been getting bolder ever since her friend David became the HOA's lawyer. I thanked Sarah for the information, my mind already racing. Sleep was a distant, impossible dream that night. The injustice of it all gnawed at me. The next morning, fueled by caffeine and a burning sense of righteous indignation, I decided to do some digging before heading to work. My family had owned a significant portion of this land before selling to developers in the 1970s. I vaguely remembered my father mentioning something about retaining certain rights, but I'd never paid much attention. I was rummaging through old, dusty boxes in my attic, the air thick with the scent of forgotten memories, when I heard the engines outside. Heavy engines. A knot of dread formed in my stomach. Rushing to my front window, I froze. My heart leapt into my throat. 3 massive bulldozers were parked across my driveway, completely blocking my car. Brenda stood beside them, resplendent in a crisp pantsuit, accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. My heart hammered against my ribs as I grabbed my phone and the folder of HOA documents. Whatever twisted game Brenda was playing, she had just made a grave error. As I stepped onto my front porch, Brenda's face lit up with a triumphant smile that sent chills down my spine. The bulldozer operators sat idling their engines, their eyes flicking between Brenda and me, waiting for instructions. "Mark Anderson," Brenda called out, her voice loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. Your violations are so egregious that immediate action has been authorized." The man beside her stepped forward, his posture radiating self-importance. "I'm David Miller, legal counsel for Willow Creek Estates HOA. These," he gestured to my garden beds with a disdainful flick of his wrist. "Unauthorized structures are being removed under Section 8.3 of the bylaws, immediate remedy for public nuisance." My neighbors watched in stunned silence. Mrs. Patel covered her mouth in horror. The Henderson kids, usually tearing down the street on their bikes, stopped dead in their tracks, staring. I walked calmly down my front steps, my mind racing, calculating. I needed to stall, to buy myself time to figure out my next move. "Mr. Miller," I said, keeping my voice steady, my tone deceptively calm. "You might want to double-check your legal footing here. Those aren't structures, they're temporary garden beds. And more importantly, you're about to make a very, very expensive mistake." David's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Your threats don't concern us, Mr. Anderson. We have the full authority of the HOA covenant." Brenda stepped forward, practically glowing with self-righteous authority. "Mark, this stubbornness is so unnecessary. Just agree to remove the eyesores, pay the accumulated fines, which are now up to $300, and we can all move on." The bulldozer engines revved louder, the sound a physical manifestation of the threat hanging in the air. The operator of the closest machine looked distinctly uncomfortable, glancing nervously between me and Brenda. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the record button. "Before you proceed, I should probably let you know that I'm recording this. And I've just texted my associate at the firm to join us. Oh, and you should probably know something else about this property." Brenda rolled her eyes dramatically. "Save the legal mumbo-jumbo, Mark. Nothing you say will stop this." Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The neighbors parted like the Red Sea as Sheriff Martinez stepped out, followed by a woman carrying what looked like official county records. Brenda's face showed a flicker of confusion, then concern. "What's going on?" she demanded. "We don't need law enforcement for a simple HOA matter." I smiled, a genuine smile for the first time that morning. Brenda, I don't think you understand exactly whose driveway you've blocked, and you definitely don't know whose land your bulldozers are parked on right now. The county clerk, Ms. Abernathy, struggled with the weight of the large, unwieldy property maps as she spread them across the hood of the sheriff's car. Neighbors inched closer, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. The bulldozer operators had cut their engines, clearly sensing the seismic shift in power. These are the original survey maps from 1973, Ms. Abernathy explained, her finger tracing the faded lines on the yellowed documents. And this is the property sale agreement between the Anderson family and Willow Creek Development Corporation. Brenda pushed forward, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. This is ridiculous. Whatever ancient paperwork you've dug up can't override our HOA authority. Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat, his voice carrying authority. Ma'am, I'd suggest you listen carefully to what Ms. Abernathy is about to explain. The county clerk adjusted her glasses, her gaze steady. According to these records, when the Anderson family sold this land for development, they retained specific rights. First, the mineral rights beneath the entire 200-acre development. Her finger traced the boundaries that encompassed our entire neighborhood. Second, all utility easements running under the main roads. And third, most importantly, explicit exemptions from any future homeowners associations for the 5 properties they kept for family members. I stepped forward, my voice ringing with newfound confidence. My house being one of those 5 properties. David Miller frantically flipped through the papers in his briefcase, his face paling with each page. That's impossible. The HOA covenant applies to all properties within the development. There's no mention of exemptions. Ms. Abernathy smiled patiently, a hint of steel in her eyes. That's because your HOA was formed in 1995, Mr. Miller. These agreements were registered with the county in 1973. Your covenant cannot override pre-existing legal arrangements. Brenda's face had turned an alarming shade of crimson. This is some kind of trick. Even if Mark's house has some special status, he still can't violate basic community standards. Actually, Sheriff Martinez interjected, his tone dry. According to county law, he can do whatever he wants with his property, as long as it doesn't violate county zoning regulations. And vegetable gardens are perfectly legal in residential zones. The crowd had grown larger. I noticed Mr. Peterson recording everything on his phone, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. Mrs. Patel was translating the situation to her elderly father in hushed tones. Brenda turned to the bulldozer operators, her voice shrill. This changes nothing. Proceed with removal, as planned. The lead operator shook his head, his face resolute. Sorry, ma'am. I'm not risking my license on disputed property. Not without a court order. I'll get one, Brenda snapped, her eyes blazing. Today, I stepped closer to Brenda and David, lowering my voice so only they could hear. There's something else you should know. Those bulldozers are currently parked on an easement that, according to these documents, belongs to me. That's trespassing on private property. And since you brought them here with clear intent to damage my property, I let the implication hang in the air, a heavy silence settling over us. David grabbed Brenda's arm, whispering urgently in her ear. Her eyes widened with something that looked a lot like fear. Sheriff, I said calmly, my voice now carrying across the yard, I'd like to file a report for attempted property damage and trespassing. Sheriff Martinez nodded, his expression grim. We can take care of that right now. This is outrageous, Brenda exploded, her voice cracking. The HOA has governed this neighborhood for decades. You can't just suddenly claim special privileges. It's not sudden, Brenda, came a frail voice from the crowd. Sarah Miller made her way forward, leaning heavily on her cane, but her eyes were bright with defiance. Some of us have known about the Anderson exemptions all along. The old board respected them. But when you took over, Brenda glared at Sarah, her face contorted with fury. "Stay out of this! Your Christmas decorations violation hearing is next week, or have you forgotten?" Several neighbors gasped at Brenda's blatant threat to the beloved 82-year-old widow. Sarah smiled sweetly, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Oh, I haven't forgotten anything, dear. In fact, my memory is quite excellent. I remember when your husband built that shed 2 feet over the Johnson property line, and when you had David here dismiss the violation because, what was it again? Administrative discretion?" The crowd began to murmur more loudly, a wave of discontent rippling through the gathering. Brenda's face flushed deeper as she looked around at the growing number of hostile faces. David Miller checked his watch nervously. "Brenda, we should continue this discussion in private. Perhaps we could schedule a proper hearing." "There will be no hearing," I interrupted, my voice firm. "My property is exempt from your authority. Those bulldozers need to be removed from my easement immediately, or I'll add additional charges to my complaint." Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "Folks, let's keep things civil. Miss Williams, Mr. Miller, I suggest you direct these operators to remove their equipment. Mr. Anderson, if you'd like to file that report, we can do so once the area is cleared." Brenda looked around desperately, realizing she was rapidly losing control of the situation and her audience. The neighbors, who had once feared her, now watched with open curiosity and satisfaction. "This isn't over," she hissed at me, her voice low and venomous. "Not by a long shot." As the bulldozers began backing away from my driveway, their engines rumbling in retreat, Sarah touched my arm gently. "Mark, dear, there's something important you should know. It's about the HOA financial records." "What about them?" I asked quietly, my curiosity piqued. Sarah glanced around cautiously. "Not here, too many ears. Come by my house this evening. Bring those old property documents. I think we've only scratched the surface of what Brenda has been up to." As Brenda and David retreated to their waiting car, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Genuine fear in their eyes. Whatever they had been trying to hide by removing my garden so hastily, they now realized they might have awakened something far more dangerous than a simple property dispute. The last bulldozer rumbled away, leaving my tomato plants untouched, a small victory in what was clearly shaping up to be a much larger battle. Sheriff Martinez approached, his citation book in hand. "Want to file that report now?" I watched Brenda's car speed away, a dark cloud disappearing down the street. "Absolutely. And Sheriff, you might want to contact the county prosecutor. I have a feeling this is going to involve more than just trespassing charges before we're done." Sarah squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "7 and tonight," she whispered. "And Mark, bring a calculator. You'll need it when you see what I've found." The neighbors began to disperse, many stopping to examine my garden beds with newfound interest. Whatever Brenda had intended, she had inadvertently turned my modest vegetable garden into a symbol of resistance. I had simply wanted to grow tomatoes in peace. Now, I was about to uncover something that would change our entire community forever. Blood rushed to my face as the bulldozer engines roared, a menacing symphony of impending destruction in front of my house. My neighbors, those silent observers, peeked through their curtains, their faces reflecting the unfolding drama. I needed to act, and I needed to act fast. With shaking hands, I called the one person who could possibly help me right now. "County Clerk's office, this is Martha speaking." "Martha, it's Mark Anderson. Remember those old land deeds we discussed last month? I need them. At my house, immediately. It's an emergency." My voice was tight, with barely suppressed panic. Brenda strutted around my front yard like she owned the place, pointing at my carefully tended garden beds and gesturing wildly to the bulldozer operators. The taller man in the suit, David, kept nodding and checking something on his clipboard, a smug expression plastered on his face. "You have exactly 30 minutes to say goodbye to your little farm," Brenda called out, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet condescension. "Maybe next time you'll learn to follow the rules, like everyone else." I stood my ground, my feet planted firmly on the earth I knew, deep down, was rightfully mine. "I suggest you don't touch anything until Martha arrives." Brenda's smile faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing her perfectly made-up face. "Who's Martha?" she snapped. "You'll see." It was all I could manage, my throat constricting with a mixture of fear and anger. The next 20 minutes were excruciating, an agonizing crawl of time. The neighbors had started to gather across the street, whispering among themselves. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle, the unfolding drama of a neighborhood power struggle. I noticed Mrs. Jenkins from across the street filming everything on her phone, her expression a mixture of shock and grim determination. Martha's county vehicle pulled up exactly 27 minutes later. She wasn't alone. She'd brought the entire property records team and 4 huge, overflowing boxes of documents. Brenda's smug expression wavered, replaced by a dawning realization that this wasn't going to be as easy as she'd thought. "What's all this?" David asked, stepping forward with his hand extended in a practiced gesture of authority. "I'm David Miller, HOA Legal Counsel." Martha pointedly ignored his outstretched hand. "Martha Gonzalez, County Clerk. I understand there's a property dispute occurring on historically significant land." Her voice was calm, professional, but there was an undercurrent of steel that made even David take a step back. I couldn't help but smile, a surge of relief washing over me as I helped Martha spread the yellowed, brittle maps and documents across the hood of my car. The oldest one dated back to 1887, my great-great-grandfather's original land purchase, a testament to my family's deep roots in this soil. "Miss Williams," Martha said, adjusting her glasses as she pointed to a boundary line on the oldest map. "Are you familiar with the Anderson Land Trust, established in 1923? Brenda crossed her arms, her face a mask of defiance. "This is ridiculous. We have HOA bylaws that clearly state—" "Oh, shush." "The bylaws don't override county law," Martha interrupted, her voice sharp and decisive, "or state law, for that matter." I pointed to a specific underlined paragraph on one of the newer documents, my finger tracing the faded ink. "This is the land sale contract from 1978 when my grandfather sold the parcels that became Willow Creek Estates. See this clause, right here?" David snatched the paper, his eyes widening as he scanned the text. His carefully constructed facade of confidence began to crumble. "It states," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "that while the surface land was sold for development, the Anderson family retained all mineral rights and utility easements." Martha explained, her voice clear and authoritative. "Additionally, the original homestead, Mr. Anderson's current property, is exempt from any future neighborhood covenants." "That's impossible," Brenda sputtered, her face turning an alarming shade of mottled red. "The HOA has been enforcing rules on that property for years. Remember that special infrastructure fee everyone in Willow Creek pays to the county each year?" I asked quietly, a knowing look in my eyes. "That money goes to my family trust, as payment for using the utility easements we still legally own." The bulldozer operators exchanged nervous glances. One of them, his face etched with worry, reached out and turned off his engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "Those bulldozers," I continued, my voice now ringing with authority, pointing to the massive machines blocking my driveway, "are currently parked directly above my legal utility easement. That's trespassing on my property." Brenda lunged toward the documents, her hands outstretched. "Let me see that," This has to be some kind of trick. At that moment, a police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing silently, a beacon of hope in the escalating chaos. Sheriff Martinez stepped out, looking grim and determined. He nodded to me before turning to Brenda. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice low and firm, "I've received reports of attempted property destruction and trespassing at this address." "This is HOA business," Brenda hissed, her voice tight with desperation. "The police have no jurisdiction over—" "Actually," Sheriff Martinez said, pulling out his citation book, his movements deliberate, "when Mr. Anderson's grandfather sold this land, he included a special provision that all disputes would fall under county jurisdiction, not private HOA arbitration." David's professional demeanor crumbled completely. "Brenda, we need to stop this, now. If what they're saying is true—" His voice trailed off, the implications of their actions sinking in. "It can't be true," Brenda shouted, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the dawning realization that she was losing control. The growing crowd of neighbors gasped as another car pulled up behind the sheriff's vehicle. Mrs. Jenkins was live-streaming everything now, her phone held high, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama for the world to see. "Mark," Brenda's voice had suddenly turned sugary sweet, a desperate attempt to regain control, to salvage the situation, to use my first name as a way to reduce the distance. "Surely we can discuss this reasonably." Sheriff Martinez approached, citation book open. "I'm going to need those bulldozers moved, immediately." The operators were already climbing back into their machines, eager to distance themselves from this escalating mess, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and apprehension. But what happened next left everyone speechless, frozen in place by the sheer audacity of it. The back door of the car behind the sheriff's vehicle opened, and a familiar figure stepped out. Someone nobody expected to see. Someone who would change everything about this fight. "Stop those machines right now!" The voice that rang out, clear and strong despite its age, belonged to Sarah Miller, the 83-year-old widow who lived 3 doors down. She leaned heavily on her cane as she made her way toward us, but her eyes were fierce, burning with a righteous fire that belied her frail appearance. Brenda rolled her eyes, a dismissive gesture that spoke volumes. "Sarah, go back home. This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" Sarah's laugh was sharp, a brittle sound that cut through the tension. "When you threatened to fine me $500 for my Christmas lights last December, you made it my concern." I hadn't seen much of Sarah since I'd helped her with some paperwork after her husband, Frank, had passed away last winter. She'd been a quiet neighbor, mostly keeping to herself, a gentle presence in our community. "Mrs. Miller," Sheriff Martinez said gently, "perhaps you should—" "I'm exactly where I need to be," Sarah cut him off, her voice unwavering. She turned to me, her gaze piercing. "Mark, show them the map. From 1978. I blinked in surprise, momentarily disoriented, but quickly found the document she wanted, my fingers fumbling slightly with the aged paper. Sarah pointed a gnarled finger at a section of Willow Creek Estates, her hand trembling slightly, but her voice strong. "See these 12 properties? Mine included? We were all part of the original purchase agreement. Mark isn't the only one with exemptions from HOA oversight." Martha leaned in, adjusting her glasses, her eyes scanning the document with professional scrutiny. "She's right. The original homesteads all carry the same protections." Brenda's face contorted, a mask of disbelief and fury. "That's absurd. The HOA has been regulating those properties for years." "Illegally," Sarah said simply, her voice ringing with quiet authority. She turned toward the growing crowd of neighbors, her gaze sweeping across their faces. "Harold, Susan, Derek, you're all originals too. 3 older residents stepped forward, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning curiosity. "Is this true?" asked Harold Pfizer, who'd lived in the corner house for decades, his voice hesitant. "They can't make me remove my radio antenna? Or fine me for my bird feeders?" Susan Winters added, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and disbelief. I watched as recognition dawned on their faces. For years, they'd been bullied by the HOA, paying fines they never needed to pay, altering their homes to meet regulations that didn't even apply to them. The injustice of it all was staggering. David pulled Brenda aside, whispering urgently in her ear, his face ashen. Her expression darkened with each word, a storm brewing behind her eyes. Sarah wasn't finished. She addressed the crowd directly, her voice rising above the murmurs. "How many of you have been harassed by this HOA, fined for ridiculous violations, threatened with legal action for minor issues?" Hands went up throughout the crowd, a sea of silent accusations. Mrs. Jenkins's live stream comment counter was exploding with responses, a digital testament to the widespread discontent. "This isn't just about Mark's garden," Sarah continued, her voice resonating with passion. "It's about how this HOA, under Brenda's leadership, has abused its power repeatedly." Sheriff Martinez nodded, his expression grim. "I've received more complaints about this HOA in the past year than all others in the county combined. Threatening elderly residents with excessive fines, ticketing guests' vehicles without warning, entering properties without permission." Brenda pushed past David, her face twisted with anger. "These allegations are completely false. We enforced the rules. Everyone agreed to them when they moved here. Except, we didn't all agree," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the noise. "And you knew that, didn't you?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The bulldozer operators had completely backed away from my driveway now, clearly wanting no part in this escalating situation. They were parked on the street, a safe distance away, watching the unfolding events with a mixture of apprehension and relief. "This isn't over," Brenda hissed at me, her voice low and menacing. "The board will hear about this and will take appropriate action." "Speaking of the board," Sarah said, reaching into her large, worn handbag, a mischievous glint in her eyes, "I have something everyone should see." She pulled out a thick manila folder and handed it to me. As I opened it, my legal training immediately recognized what I was looking at. Bank statements, transfer records, articles of incorporation. The raw data of financial transactions. "Where did you get this?" I asked Sarah in shock, my voice barely above a whisper. "My late husband, Frank, was an accountant for 50 years, she replied with a small, sad smile. "When they fined me for my Christmas lights, I got curious about where all that money was going, started requesting public records. Frank taught me how to read between the lines. I flipped through the documents, each page more damning than the last. The HOA had been collecting special assessment fees from every household, ostensibly for a community pool renovation that had never happened. Over $300,000 in US dollars had disappeared, vanished into a company called WCE Holdings LLC. My stomach churned. I turned to the last page, the LLC registration document. The managing members were listed clearly, their names stark and undeniable, David Miller and Brenda Williams. Brenda saw what I was looking at, and she lunged for the folder, her eyes blazing with fury. "That's private HOA business." Sheriff Martinez stepped between us, his hand resting on his holster, a silent warning. "Ma'am, I suggest you step back right now." As community members gathered closer, eager to see what had caused such a violent reaction, David quietly slipped away toward his car, his carefully constructed facade of professionalism completely shattered. "These are serious allegations," Martha said, looking over my shoulder at the documents, her voice grave. "If these records are accurate, this goes beyond HOA disputes. This is criminal territory. Brenda's confident facade finally cracked, crumbling into dust. You have no idea who you're dealing with, she snarled at me, her voice raw with desperation. My husband plays golf with Judge Brennan every Sunday. This will all disappear by tomorrow. I held her gaze steadily, my voice calm and unwavering. You might want to check the news, Brenda. Judge Brennan announced his retirement last week, after the ethics investigation. A murmur went through the crowd, a wave of understanding washing over them. Mrs. Jenkins zoomed in with her phone, capturing Brenda's horrified expression for her growing online audience. Sarah placed a gentle hand on my arm, her touch surprisingly strong. There's more, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising tide of murmurs. So much more. As the sheriff began taking statements from neighbors about HOA abuses, a litany of grievances pouring forth, I wondered just how deep this corruption went, and who else might be involved. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. Our community would never be the same. My hands trembled as I opened Sarah's folder, the weight of the secrets it held heavy in my grasp. Inside were bank statements, meticulously organized, with bright yellow sticky notes marking suspicious transactions, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a shocking truth. The HOA had been collecting an extra $300 a month from each household, claiming it was for a much-needed pool renovation. But the pool looked exactly the same as it had 3 years ago, a neglected relic of broken promises. Over $300,000 is missing, I whispered, running my finger down the column of numbers, my voice thick with disbelief. Where did all this money go? Sarah leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioner. Keep turning pages, Mark. The next document showed a series of wire transfers, large sums of money moving from the HOA account to a business called Williams & Miller Consulting. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I looked up at Sarah, my mouth hanging open, the words caught in my throat. Brenda Williams and David Miller. She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. They've been stealing from us for years. How did you find this? I asked, still reeling from the shock, the sheer audacity of their deception. Sarah's eyes sparkled with a hint of pride, a flicker of the woman she once was. My Frank was an accountant for 42 years before he passed. He taught me how to read these statements, how to follow the money. When Brenda fined me $200 for leaving my Christmas lights up 2 days too long, I got angry, so I started looking. At the HOA papers, they send us every month, the ones nobody ever reads. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen. We need to tell everyone, right now. Wait, Sarah said, placing a restraining hand on my arm. There's more. Look at the last page. The final document was a preliminary purchase agreement, outlining a plan to acquire 5 specific properties within Willow Creek Estates. My blood ran cold as I read the details. The HOA, under Brenda's leadership, planned to use a series of obscure and selectively enforced rules to force 5 elderly homeowners, including Sarah, to sell their houses at below-market prices. They planned to buy the properties through their company and flip them for double the price, I said, my voice shaking with outrage. They're targeting people who can't fight back, people like you, people who live alone, who might get scared by legal threats. Sheriff Martinez, who had been listening quietly, his expression growing increasingly grim, shook his head. This goes way beyond HOA problems. This is fraud, embezzlement, elder abuse, possibly more. I stood up straight, my decision made, my resolve hardening like steel. I'm calling an emergency neighborhood meeting. Tonight, 7:30 at the clubhouse. 3 hours later, I stood in our crowded clubhouse, the air thick with anticipation and a palpable sense of collective anger. People sat in chairs, stood against the walls, and even crowded by the windows outside, straining to hear. I had connected my laptop to the big screen on the wall, displaying the incriminating evidence page by page, a damning indictment of Brenda and David's greed. These people, we trusted them to run our community, I said, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart, have stolen over $300,000 from us, money that was supposed to fix our pool, our roads, our playground. Gasps filled the room as I showed where the money had gone, the digital trail leading directly to Brenda and David's shell company. When I revealed the plan to push out elderly neighbors, forcing them to sell their homes at a fraction of their worth, angry shouts erupted, a chorus of outrage echoing through the room. "Where are Brenda and David now?" someone called out, their voice sharp with anger. "They were invited to this meeting," I replied, "but chose not to come. Their absence speaks volumes." Mr. Peterson, a retired judge who lived on the corner, his presence commanding respect, stood up. "I move that we vote immediately to remove the entire board and elect temporary leaders until we can hold proper elections." The vote was unanimous. 76 hands raised in unison, a powerful wave of collective action to dissolve the current HOA board, to dismantle the structure that had enabled Brenda and David's corruption. As neighbors lined up to sign the legal documents I'd prepared, a sense of shared purpose filling the room. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The caller ID showed Brenda's name. I stepped outside into the cool evening air to take the call. "You've ruined everything," she said, her voice a venomous hiss, a mixture of anger and panic. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You think you've won because your family once owned some dirt around here? This isn't about winning, Mark," I replied calmly, my voice devoid of emotion. "This is about doing what's right." "Right?" She laughed, but it sounded hollow, forced, a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Mark. Your precious little garden is just the beginning of what I can take from you." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there in the cool evening air, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets, wondering what she meant. What could she possibly do now that the whole neighborhood knew the truth? Now that her power had been stripped away. Back inside, the clubhouse was buzzing with activity. People were already forming committees, one to audit all HOA finances, another to review and simplify the community rules, a third to reach out to the elderly residents who had been targeted by Brenda's scheme. Sarah sat at a table, surrounded by neighbors, hanging on her every word, as she explained, in meticulous detail, how she uncovered the intricate web of deception. My phone buzzed again. Another text message, this time from an unknown number. The message was chillingly simple. "Check your security cameras, now." I pulled up the app on my phone, displaying the live video feed from my house. What I saw made my stomach drop. A cold wave of A cold wave of nausea washing over me. Two figures, cloaked in darkness, were moving around my front yard. Even in the dim, grainy footage, I could make out Brenda's distinctive blonde hair and David's tall, lanky frame. They were systematically ripping up my garden plants, tearing them from the earth with a savage fury, and throwing them across the lawn, a scene of wanton destruction. My carefully tended tomato seedlings, the symbol of my hard-won peace, were being brutally destroyed. I showed the live feed to Sheriff Martinez, who was still at the clubhouse taking statements. He immediately called for a patrol car to head to my house, his face grim with determination. But as we watched, transfixed by the horrifying scene unfolding on my phone screen, Brenda looked directly at the security camera, a chillingly cruel smile playing on her lips. She made a slow, deliberate slashing motion across her throat, a clear and unmistakable threat before they both got into a dark-colored car and sped away, disappearing into the night. As people crowded around to see the shocking footage on my phone screen, another text message arrived, this one even more chilling than the last. "This is just the beginning. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you never planted a single seed." The words hung in the air, a palpable threat. "Can you arrest them for this?" I asked Sheriff Martinez, my voice tight with anger and a growing sense of unease. "Trespassing, vandalism, and with these threats, possibly more," he nodded, his jaw set. "But Mark, be careful. People who feel cornered can be dangerous." Sarah put her frail hand on my arm, her touch surprisingly strong, a source of comfort in the escalating chaos. "You're not alone anymore, Mark. None of us are." As I looked around at the determined faces of my neighbors, people who had been strangers, mere acquaintances, just days ago, I realized she was right. Brenda and David had the money, and they had held the power, wielded it ruthlessly for years. But we had something stronger, the truth and each other. A newfound sense of community, forged in the crucible of shared adversity. My phone buzzed again. Another text, this time with a photo attachment. I opened it and felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold and shaky. It was a picture of the old, crucial documents, the very ones that proved my property's exemptions, the foundation of our fight. Across the image, someone had scrawled, in thick, red marker, a single, terrifying sentence: "Originals burn so easily." I woke the next morning to the sound of shattering glass, a sharp, violent sound that pierced the pre-dawn quiet. Racing downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest, I found my kitchen window smashed, a gaping hole where glass had once been. My garden was completely destroyed. The security camera footage, time-stamped 3:00 a.m., showed Brenda and David, their faces contorted with rage, ripping up my plants, scattering debris across the lawn, a scene of utter devastation. I texted Sarah immediately, my fingers fumbling on the screen. Within an hour, 5 news vans were parked outside my house, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting our story to the world. A reporter, microphone in hand, approached me, her expression a mixture of sympathy and professional curiosity. "Mr. Anderson, is it true the former HOA president destroyed your property after you exposed her alleged theft of hundreds of thousands of dollars from the community?" By noon, a small army of neighbors, armed with shovels, trowels, and a vibrant array of new plants, showed up at my house, their faces determined, their spirits undaunted. "We're with you, Mark," said Mrs. Jenkins, who I barely knew, but who had become an unexpected ally in this fight. "Brenda tried to fine me $500 for my bird feeder last month. It's time we took our neighborhood back." Sheriff Martinez arrived, a sheaf of papers in his hand, his expression grim but resolute. "Brenda Williams and David Miller have been arrested. The county has launched a full-scale investigation. We've found over $300,000 missing from HOA accounts and evidence suggesting a much wider pattern of fraud and embezzlement." The neighbors, working together, replanted my garden, transforming the scene of destruction into a vibrant testament to community resilience. We worked side by side, sharing stories, laughter, and a newfound sense of unity. The neighbors voted that very day to create a new, friendly neighbors group, replacing the oppressive HOA with a structure built on trust, transparency, and mutual respect. We wrote fair, reasonable rules together, rules that allowed people to garden, to express their individuality, to live their lives without fear of arbitrary fines and petty regulations. 2 months later, we held a huge block party, a celebration of our newfound freedom, in what used to be Brenda's meticulously manicured, but now ironically empty, front yard. Her house had been sold, quickly and quietly, after she and David were formally charged and jailed, awaiting trial. The new family, young and vibrant, loved our community garden idea, embracing the spirit of cooperation and shared responsibility. Sarah, her eyes sparkling with joy, handed me the first ripe, red tomato of the season, a symbol of our collective victory. "You changed everything, Mark," she said, her voice filled with emotion. I smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "I never wanted to own the county, Sarah. I just wanted to grow my vegetables in peace." This story highlights the importance of standing up for what's right, even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds. It underscores the power of community, the strength that can be found in unity and collective action. It reminds us that even the smallest act of defiance, like planting a garden, can become a symbol of resistance against corruption and abuse of power. It also showed that sometimes an old document may save many people, and standing for the right is very important. What do you think of this story? Have you ever experienced a similar situation with an HOA or other governing body? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire and empower.